The story begins in silence. An abandoned farmhouse, its wooden beams rotting, its windows blackened by decades of dust. The land around it stretches empty, swallowed by weeds and silence. And inside these crumbling walls once lived a man whose very existence was a secret America never wanted to face. A man who broke every boundary of blood and kinship by marrying the woman who gave him life. The story you are about to hear is not folklore. It is not myth. It is history, hidden in shadows, buried by shame, and left to decay in the ruins of forgotten families. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The tale of this man begins not with his marriage, but with his birth. From the moment he entered the world, his life was shaped by secrets his small town refused to speak of. His father was never named, and his mother, his only anchor in a world that shunned her, kept him close. Too close. Locals whispered that the boy was different. His eyes seemed mismatched, his speech sometimes broken, his understanding of the world bent in ways others couldn't quite explain. And yet, behind those unsettling features was a child who clung desperately to the only person who had ever accepted him, the woman who had brought him into existence. As he grew, the town turned away. Neighbors avoided their farmhouse. Children were warned never to play near him, and church doors quietly closed whenever he tried to step inside. Isolation wrapped around him like a second skin, and in that isolation, something darker began to take root, a relationship that should never have been possible, and yet somehow became inevitable. By the time he was a teenager, rumors spread like wildfire. He was not just his mother's son, but her closest companion, her only confidant, the shadow that followed her everywhere. They ate together, worked together, and slept under the same fragile roof that seemed to creak with the weight of their secret. To the outside world they were strange, perhaps pitiful, but inside that house they were building something far more disturbing, an intimacy born not of love, but of bloodlines twisted into knots that could never be untangled. What happens next is the kind of truth most families bury, most towns deny, and most historians ignore. Yet it is here, in these cracks of America's forgotten past, that the story of the most inbred man in history truly begins. The story of this man cannot be told without first understanding the woman who gave him life, and ultimately claimed him as her husband. She had been born into a family already fractured by secrets, carrying with her the scars of generations who blurred the lines between kinship and desire. To the outside world, she was a quiet woman, plain, withdrawn, but fiercely protective of her only child. To those who dared whisper behind closed doors, she was dangerous, unnatural, a woman who could not tell the difference between motherhood and possession. Her life was marked by shame long before her son's birth. The name of his father was never spoken, not once. Some said it was her own father. Others whispered about a brother, a cousin, a man who shared her blood in ways that should have remained forbidden. What was certain was this: the boy's life began already wrapped in the chains of incest, and the mother's obsession with him was born from guilt as much as love. She raised him not as a son to grow into his own man, but as an extension of herself, her mirror, her comfort, her companion. Their farmhouse became a world unto itself, sealed tight against the judgmental eyes of the town. Days blurred into nights, seasons into years, and the outside world slowly disappeared. By the time the boy reached adulthood, he had never known what it meant to be free of her shadow. And then, one day, the whispers that had followed them for years finally gained shape. In a quiet, shocking ceremony no church would host and no courthouse would honor, the man married the woman who had carried him into this world. Their union was not blessed, not recognized, and certainly not celebrated. It was whispered of in bars, spat about in hushed voices after Sunday sermons, and passed down in warning as though it were a ghost story. But to them it was something else. The mother believed she had elevated their bond into permanence, making their isolation into destiny. The son, confused, broken, yet desperate for belonging, accepted her as both mother and wife. Together they sealed their fate, bound not only by blood, but by choices that turned them into pariahs, legends of horror whispered about, but never fully confronted. The town tried to bury them in silence, but silence cannot erase what happened within those walls, nor the children that would follow, children who bore not only the genetic scars of their parents' union, but also the heavy weight of a legacy America refused to acknowledge. It is one thing for a man to marry his own mother, it is another for them to bring children into the world. And that is where this story turns from a local whisper into a generational curse. Their children were born into silence, but silence could not hide the truth. The first child came small, fragile, and unwell. Its cries were weak, its eyes unfocused, and the townsfolk who heard them murmured among themselves, "That's not right. That's not natural." The child survived only a short while, buried quickly in a plot no one marked, as if the land itself wanted to forget. But there were others. Some were born with twisted spines and malformed limbs. Others carried the faces of children, but the minds that never seemed to grow past infancy. And yet, the mother and son, now husband and wife, kept trying, as if desperate to prove that their love could defy the laws of blood. The children became living testaments to the price of incest, reminders that what happened in that farmhouse could never be hidden, no matter how tightly the curtains were drawn. The town grew uneasy. People who once ignored the farmhouse now crossed the road to avoid even seeing it. Rumors of curses spread, with whispers that the family line was haunted, damned from the start. For some, the children were proof of God's punishment. For others, they were simply victims, tiny bodies born into a cycle they had no power to break. And yet, despite the horror, the mother carried herself with pride. To her, these children were proof of her devotion, proof that she and her son were bound in ways others could never understand. She dressed them carefully, paraded them on the rare occasions she dared step into town, daring anyone to confront her openly. No one did, because in small towns, silence often reigns stronger than justice. The son, however, was different. He loved his children, yes, but he could not ignore what they reflected back at him, the truth of who he was and the weight of what he had done. His own features, already unsettling, already marked by whispers of inbreeding from generations past, seemed sharper when mirrored in his offspring. He began to withdraw, even from his mother-wife, spending long hours staring into nothing, as though trying to find a way to escape the life that had been forced upon him. But there was no escape. Their marriage had already carved its place in history, not in official records, not in newspapers, but in the mouths of those who whispered in the dark. A story too shameful to print, too haunting to erase. By the time their children grew into the world, the farmhouse had become more than a home. It was a prison of secrets. Its walls absorbed every whisper. Its floorboards groaned under the weight of truths too monstrous to speak aloud. Visitors were rare. Those who dared approach told stories of strange sounds at night, of shadows moving in the windows, of children with hollow eyes watching from behind torn curtains. To the town, the house itself had become cursed, a place where the normal rules of family and society had been erased. Inside, the family lived in a rhythm that blurred the lines of time. Meals were eaten together in silence, long stretches of day spent tending to the land with hands cracked by labor. The children, though fragile and often ill, were expected to work too. Their laughter was never heard. Their cries, when they came, were quickly silenced by the mother, who demanded obedience above all. She was the center of the household, ruling not only as mother and wife, but as matriarch of a dynasty that should never have existed. The son, now a man trapped in middle age, carried the look of someone already broken. He rarely spoke except to his children, and even then, his words often came out stilted, fragmented, as though language itself was slipping away from him. Some claimed he spoke in murmurs no one could understand, words that belonged to no tongue at all. Whether madness or isolation, no one could say. The townsfolk, meanwhile, could not decide how to treat them. Some avoided the family entirely, refusing to even acknowledge their existence. Others treated them as living warnings, pointing to the children as proof of what happens when sin is allowed to grow unchecked. A few pitied them, but pity was a dangerous thing in such a place, because pity meant looking too closely, and looking too closely meant risking the same judgment that had condemned the family in the first place. And so, the farmhouse rotted quietly, shutters loosened, roof tiles slipped. The land around it became overgrown, as though nature itself was trying to reclaim the space. Yet inside, the family endured, clinging to a twisted idea of love that had already consumed them. Their existence became a paradox, too visible to be denied, yet too shameful to ever be confronted openly. The most unsettling truth, however, was this: their story was not unique. Across America, in hidden valleys and forgotten hollows, families like theirs existed, tucked away from the eyes of the nation, repeating the same cycles of blood and silence. But this family, this man who married his own mother, stood apart, not just because of what they did, but because of how determined they were to make it their legacy. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have turned away, or would you have tried to break the curse? Because what happened next is the part of the story few can stomach. As the years dragged on, the family line began to collapse under the weight of its own choices. The children who survived grew into adults who were marked both physically and mentally by the blood they carried. Some could never speak clearly, their words slurred and broken. Others walked with twisted gaits or carried eyes that looked in two directions at once. They were living evidence of what their parents had done, and yet they too were trapped in the same cycle of isolation. Whispers spread that some of the children turned inward, marrying among themselves, repeating the pattern their father had been born into. If true, it meant the family's bloodline folded back in on itself again and again, compounding the damage until each new birth was more fragile, more broken than the last. Outsiders shuddered at the thought, but no one dared interfere. In towns like this, silence was safer than truth. For the son-turned-husband, the years brought only deepening despair. He no longer resembled a man so much as a spectre, a figure who moved slowly across the farmhouse porch with hollow eyes and muttered prayers no one could understand. Some said he had finally realized what he had done. Others believed he had sunk too deep into madness to ever surface again. Whatever the case, he was no longer in control of the story. The mother was still the force holding the family together, her will unbroken even as the walls decayed and her children withered. But every secret has its breaking point, and the families could not last forever. By the mid-20th century, outsiders began documenting stories like their sociologists, journalists, even government investigators, all trying to uncover what had been ignored for so long. When their eyes finally turned toward the farmhouse, the world outside began to glimpse what the town had buried for decades. The story of a man who married his own mother could no longer remain in whispers. It was about to become a legend, passed not only in hushed tones, but in ink, photographs, and memory. And once exposed, the family's curse would ripple outward, disturbing not only the town that tried to hide it, but the entire country that realized such stories were not as rare as it wanted to believe. The exposure did not come with pity, nor with justice. It came with fascination, disgust, and a kind of horrified curiosity that spread like wildfire. Reporters who stumbled across the family's story described them in tones that blurred the line between anthropology and spectacle, words that stripped them of humanity and turned them into an exhibit of degeneration. Photographs, when they appeared, were treated like evidence of a crime against nature itself. People who had never stepped foot in their town now spoke of them as though they were monsters, forgetting that they were also human beings, born into a cycle they had never chosen. The son, the man at the center of it all, rarely appeared in these accounts. He was described as a shadow, a figure who wandered the property muttering to himself, his body hunched, his features marked by years of inbreeding and isolation. To some, he was pitiable. To others, he was the very embodiment of sin. But what no one could deny was that he had become a symbol an unwanted reminder that America's history was not just one of progress and purity, but of hidden valleys where bloodlines folded in on themselves in silence. As stories circulated, the town itself fell under scrutiny. How could such a thing have happened under their watch? How could an entire community turn a blind eye? And yet when asked, locals responded the same way they always had, with silence. They refused to speak, to confirm or deny, as though words themselves might curse them. The farmhouse, they insisted, was better left alone. But the damage was already done. The family's story had escaped the boundaries of their land, their town, and their silence. It became a dark mirror held up to the nation, forcing Americans to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that incest, secrecy, and generational trauma were not foreign evils, but homegrown ones. The son who married his own mother was no longer just a man. He was a legend of shame, a ghost story dressed in flesh, a warning whispered across state lines. And still, amid the frenzy, the family endured. The mother aged into frailty, but clung to her role, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. The children, scattered between the farmhouse and shallow graves, were proof that love twisted by blood could not escape consequence. And the man himself faded further into obscurity, becoming less a person than a spectre, living proof of a truth the country was desperate to forget, yet fascinated to remember. The farmhouse is gone now. The land where it once stood has been reclaimed by weeds and silence. The walls collapsed, the roof caved in. But if you walk through the fields on a cold autumn night, locals say you can still feel it, the weight of secrets pressing down, the echo of children's cries, the shadow of a man who carried a burden too heavy for one life to hold. The house may have rotted into the soil, but its story still lingers like a wound that never fully closes. The man himself did not die in any dramatic fashion. There were no torches, no mobs, no arrests. He simply faded away, his body as fragile as his mind. Some accounts say he was buried beside his mother-wife, as though even death could not untangle their bond. Others claim his grave is unmarked, hidden in an overgrown patch of earth, left nameless to spare the town one last shame. Whichever is true, he was laid to rest not as a son, not as a husband, but as something in between, a figure who defied all roles, and in doing so, became nothing at all. Yet his story lives on, precisely because America tried so hard to bury it. When we speak of history, we like to imagine it as progress, clean lines, noble struggles, victories that lead us forward. But hidden inside that history are stories like this one, stories of families that folded in on themselves, towns that looked away, and children who carried the scars of choices made long before they were born. Stories that remind us how fragile the line between love and destruction can be. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the man who married his own mother was not a monster by birth. He was a child, born into silence, shaped by a woman who blurred the boundaries of kinship until they broke. He was a product of secrecy, of shame, of a cycle that had been set in motion long before he ever drew his first breath. And that cycle, though shocking, is not as rare as we like to believe. Even today, in hidden corners of the world, and perhaps closer than we think, there are families carrying burdens just like his. What we inherit is not always chosen. What we pass down is not always clean. And sometimes, the darkest parts of history are not found in books or museums, but in the whispers of forgotten towns, in the ruins of broken houses, and in the lives of people we were never meant to remember. This was the story of the most inbred man America kept in the shadows. A story the land tried to swallow, the town tried to erase, and the nation tried to deny. But once uncovered, it becomes impossible to forget.